Welcome to Combat Conditional, a turn-based gaming podcast. My name is David Oliver Kling, your host, and I've been playing these types of games since 1986. You might be asking yourself, what is turn-based gaming? It is a type of gaming that has been called play-by-mail gaming, and as the genre evolved, as play-by-email gaming. The genre is ever-changing and is now often referred to as turn-based gaming. Many games being offered are like board games, with several different games providing role-playing opportunities as well. It all depends on the game. In this podcast, I will be sharing news on the industry and interviews with both players and game producers and designers. This podcast is sponsored by Suspense and Decision magazine, which started publication on November 30th, 2013, and is now being published by Talisman Consulting. Check it out. There is a link in the show notes. Welcome to episode 1 of Combat Conditional, where I talk about turn-based gaming, also known as play-by-mail gaming or play-by-email gaming. In this episode, I have the honor of welcoming Raven Zachary to the podcast. I've known Raven for many years. We played in a play-by-mail game Outtime days back in the 1980s, and he joins me to talk about play-by-mail gaming past, present, and future. Let's get started. Thank you, Raven, for joining me. It's so good to talk to you again. I know I mentioned in the introduction that we first met back in the 1980s playing Outtime days together. I thought what we would do first, since this is the first episode of the podcast, which I've named Combat Conditional, let's talk about what is turn-based gaming. What is play-by-mail gaming or play-by-email gaming? How would you define it?
Yeah, great question. So the origins of this gaming genre, and it's called by different terms, play by mail or play by post, play by email, turn-based gaming. There's all these sorts of terms that are focused on the same genre of games. It has its origin in the 1970s with postal gaming. Back before it was organized by companies who were doing this and running games for players, imagine playing chess by mail. Let's say you had a friend who was deployed in the armed services and was overseas. You could play a game of chess by essentially just mailing a letter to your friend and having those moves slowly go back and forth. I mean, chess is a turn-based game, right? Black and white go in alternating order, starting with white, and you can imagine sending those orders back and forth through the mail. In the later 1970s, it was really turned into an industry hobby. You had companies starting in the late 70s who were running these games professionally. Initially, hand-moderated, no computers involved. People would sit down with papers and pencils and write things, send in their orders via post in the mail, and the game master would receive all of these orders from various players, process them, and send the result back. This hobby has changed over the years. It started focused on postal mail because that was the best way to get printed information back and forth between the players and the game masters. It then shifted towards email, play-by-email games in the early to mid-90s as you saw the proliferation of the internet. And then with the proliferation of the web later in the 90s and into the aughts of the next century, you saw play-by browser or play-by web-based games where you could submit your orders through a web form. They would be processed by a computer, and then you would generally get those sent back to you via email. So there's really, I think, three things that play-by-mail games or turn-based games do very well. It's paced games, large games, and open-ended games. Not all play-by-mail games do all three of them. There are some play-by-mail games that are victory conditions-based games, which aren't open-ended. They have a defined beginning and defined end with various victory conditions that you must fulfill to win. But there are also some play-by-mail games that are open-ended, which means you're in that game for as long as you want to play until you're eliminated or you choose to quit. And I think let's just walk briefly through these three things that I think play-by-mail does well, and in fact does better than any other genre of game. So the first one is a paced game. In the modern world, you rarely have 4 to 6 hours of uninterrupted time. If you want to sit down with a large group and play a role-playing game campaign, or you want to play a large epic board game, it's really hard to find this time, especially in COVID, where we've been generally less social than we have been over the last 2.5 years. I can play a play-by-mail game in 15-minute increments. I sit down in my computer, I do my planning, I do my processing. I may have these little 15-minute chunks of time as a working adult, as a parent, as a spouse, as a worker, it's easier for me to get 15 minutes of time than it is to get 4 to 6 hours of uninterrupted time. So the paced part is key because I can adapt the hobby to my own schedule, which is, I think, a key aspect of why this has been successful for me, this kind of gaming in my life. The second one is large games. Most board games can only be 2 to 6 players, and I would think that most role-playing game campaigns are 3 to 6 players generally. With play-by-mail games or turn-based games, you can have dozens or hundreds of players in the exact same game, which is a pretty exciting space to play in because you have all of this human element of coordination, diplomacy, packs, working together, making alliances, doing trading, and these types of things. And the third aspect is I think what's really key is the open-endedness. And again, this does not apply to all play-by-mail games, but it's the games I find myself gravitating most towards, which is this sense of long-term commitment and feeling immersed in the story over the course of many years, and not just sitting down for a 2-hour board game or a 45-minute board game and then it's over. When I play a long board game, I'm left with this feeling of this kind of immersive experience. I have stories to tell. My best gaming experiences with board games have been these long, epic, multi-session experiences, whether that's, sitting down over the course of a weekend and playing Mega Civilization, which is a big 10 to 20 hour long epic civilization game. Once I played a 5-year long epic game of Empires and Arms, is an Avalon Hill Napoleonic war game. We played that one Sunday every month for 5 years, or even sitting down to play a 6 to 8 hour long Twilight Imperium game. These are great long experiences, but imagine playing a 300 or a 3,000 hour long game over the course of multiple years. You have these incredible stories. You're building this world with other people. And these are things, you and I often will reminisce about some of these incredible experiences we had in the 1980s and 1990s playing play-by-mail games together because they're so immersive. And, it saddens me a bit that this is a genre of gaming that has declined. And if you look at why, there's, I think, a couple of reasons why this declined. And then I would love to get your feedback since I've been speaking nonstop for the last few minutes. Peak PBM, the peak of this turn-based gaming genre really was in the late 80s and 1990s before the internet was pervasive and video games took over. It's not just the fault of video games. Video games, I think, were part of it. They were part of the reason why the younger generation of gamers didn't move into play-by-mail games because video gaming was so accessible and you could play it in, again, short-term increments. It's a very kind of immediate response, kind of a frenetic, immediate payback. But it's also, I think, in the late 90s, there was this genre of games called collectible card games, CCGs. And I think the growth of the CCG market, which grew incredibly fast in the late 90s and then collapsed with the economic downturn in the early aughts, that I think a combination of video games and collectible card games were the reason why younger gamers didn't come into that hobby. And so you kind of had a freeze on new players coming into this hobby, and the older generation has aged out and it just hasn't been replaced. And add to that the fact that postal costs and term processing costs went way up. Cost of labor went up, cost of postage went up, and then the internet eliminated a lot of the need to send letters because we had email. And so I think it was just bad timing. COVID should have seen the resurgence of PBMs. We should have seen this great return to the PBM or turn-based gaming genre because we were stuck at home for 2 years. But the game masters that are still operating games in this genre didn't really take the opportunity to market and promote this genre, unfortunately. And so we didn't see a resurgence that I was hoping for in the last 2 years.
Yeah, I would agree. We had an opportunity with COVID and it wasn't taken. And that's, very much unfortunate. Not much I can add to your definition of play-by-mail gaming and your brief synopsis of the genre, which was excellent, by the way. I would add that I love video games, and I was a World of Warcraft player for probably 10 years before I got tired of paying $15 a month. And you do the math, that's like $1,500 I think I paid playing World of Warcraft over 10 years. But one thing about the MMO genre is similar in a way to play-by-mails. It's open-ended play-by-mails. But one of the problems is the game company that makes the game controls the narrative of the game 100%. All you're doing is inserting your character, your tune into that and playing the story that they have written. But with turn-based gaming, with play-by-mail gaming, the players control the narrative in a way. I mean, the game master creates the framework, but then the players flesh it out. And that's the difference, I think.
Yeah, especially in these open-ended games where there's this notion of special actions. Special actions is a concept in play-by-mail games that's in some games, not all, where you can essentially write a custom order that happens outside of the framework of the mechanics of the game. Think of it kind of like a role-playing aspect of a game where you could take the game in an entirely different direction if the game master wishes to allow you as the player to do that.
Yeah, and I've got so many memories of playing different play-by-mail games over the years where I can talk for a long time about the things that we did outside of the turns, just on the phone. I remember being, 16, 17 years old, living at home in the 80s with $100+ phone bill because I was talking to people across the country between turns about what we were going to do. And those memories I cherish those memories. And that was just a great experience. When I first met you, I was in the Navy. I was stationed in Washington, D.C. We were playing out time days together. I think my character was Al Capone and yours was Anton Mueller. And I still remember that. I still remember the conversations that we had. I remember being in my barracks room, pacing back and forth on the phone because I had a cord because it was a landline. We didn't have cell phones back then. And we were talking about what we were going to be doing in game. Those are great memories. And I think this genre of gaming fosters that. It's the reason why I love playing MMOs is not because I usually play with other people. I tend to play at weird hours of the night, so I'm oftentimes a solo player, but I like being a part of a community and seeing other people around doing their thing. And I think that's the draw for turn-based gaming. You're not playing a game by yourself. You're playing a game with tens of other people and sometimes hundreds of other people. And I think that's aspect of turn-based gaming that's just pretty awesome. And I wish more people would learn about it.
I completely agree. There's about 70 play-by-mail games that are still being offered from 34 different game masters or companies. If people are interested in seeing that list, it's up on the Suspense and Decision blog. The best way to get to it is either just to Google for Suspense and Decision, quite a mouthful, the Suspense and Decision website from Google, or else if you go to bit.ly/games index. That's bit.ly/games index. You can get right to that index. And I try to keep that list up to date every few months of what play-by-mail or turn-based games still exist and are being offered to players.
Excellent. I will put a link to that in the show notes. Let's switch gears a little bit. We've talked already a little bit about the past. In this episode, I want to talk about past, present, and future. So do you have some words that you can add to what you've already shared about the past within play-by-mail gaming?
Yeah, so looking back at kind of the peak of play-by-mail games, which again, as a reminder, kind of late 1980s to late 1990s, that time period, you had multiple magazines dedicated to this hobby. You had multiple conferences. People were holding conferences just for play-by-mail gamers. I went to Gen Con, which is a large role-playing game-based and board gaming-based conference back in 1987 as a 13-year-old kid, and there were dozens of play-by-mail game vendors who would run these games professionally at that conference. There were ads in the back of Dragon magazine, which was the magazine read by Dungeons and Dragons players. That's how I first found out about play-by-mail games in 1983. As a 10-year-old kid, I think by the time I was 11, a year later, I was playing in multiple games. You pay a small turn fee, somewhere between $2 and $6, which although at the time as a 10 or 11-year-old kid, it was a lot of money. But as you mentioned, we both spent more money on long-distance phone bills at that time.
That's right.
Talking to players than we did paying the game masters to run our games for us. I mean, it was a whole genre, a very popular genre of games. And there were people who had companies with dozens of employees that would process turns. I mean, one of the worst memories I have actually as a kid playing play-by-mail games was missing the turn deadline. This was actually not that uncommon. You'd send in your orders as a letter, and it would arrive at the address of the game master, let's say a day or two late, and you would miss the turn processing deadline. And so you would get back in the mail what was called a maintenance turn or an auto turn, which is basically your position did nothing or almost nothing that turn. And that was a horrible letter to get back in the mail because you missed the deadline because the mailman or the mailwoman or whatever it was, just made the 1 or 2 days late, unfortunately.
Yeah, I hated those things. I hated the maintenance turns.
Yeah.
So what can you say about if the renaissance in turn-based gaming was the late 80s to the late 90s. What can be said about the current state of play-by-mail gaming today?
Yeah, a couple comments. Certainly a smaller player base, a smaller game base, down to 70. There probably were hundreds of these games running in the 80s and 90s. The size of the market is quite small. No one's really put their finger on the pulse of the size of this market because this is not data that's generally shared between the game masters. But my guess is that you're talking about probably somewhere between 750 and 2,000 players, which seems incredibly small when you compare that to something like the size of the board gaming hobby or the size of the role-playing gaming hobby. Most people have multiple board game stores in their city nearby. So it seems incredibly small when I estimate 750 to 2,000 players. But, for 70 games, that would kind of make sense, right? When you have in any game anywhere between, let's say, 20 and 200 players. There's a couple play-by-mail games that have more than 200 players. But I would say that in most of those cases, those aren't 200 people in the same game. That could be a game like Middle-earth or Hyborian War, which is a victory conditions-based game. And those games have anywhere between, let's say, 10 and 40 players. But some of the larger games, Supernova, which are open-ended games, those have hundreds of players. Because of the prison population, PBMs actually have quite a strong following in the prison system because it is a form of gaming that actually still exists. And because of the lack of internet access and video game access in prisons, of course, play-by-mail gaming has a very strong following in prisons. In fact, in one prison, USP Tucson, a federal facility in Tucson, Arizona, there are over 50 play-by-mail gamers just in one prison.
Oh, wow.
It's quite popular. And a lot of those players are playing a game called Supernova, which is a kind of a 4X open-ended space exploration game. But there are others, too. There's about 10, I think, play-by-mail games that still offer postal service. And so the prisoners, this is one way that they can have entertainment is play-by-mail games from prison.
Yeah, that's fascinating. That's probably a market that's not being tapped very well by the companies that are out there now.
Not very well. I mean, I did create a flyer for the prisoner players to pass around that has a list of all of the games that offer postal service. And I'm told that's being photocopied and traded around in the prison system because a lot of the prisoners only knew about one game. They knew about the game that a friend of theirs maybe turned them on to. But I've been trying to educate prison population a little bit more about the breadth and depth of the hobby.
I wonder if there's a way, do prisoners have access to podcasts?
It depends on the prison. It depends on the crime. So there is and also depends on whether you're in a state or federal facility. So if you're in a state facility, you're beholden to whatever the state laws are related to the laws of that state related to access to the internet. I would say in most cases, most prisoners have access to an incredibly basic email service. In the federal prison system, where I think play-by-mail games are more popular, there is a system called CoreLinks, and CoreLinks is kind of a private email server. I can't directly email a prisoner with an email address, but what I can do is log into the CoreLinks site and I can type in the prisoner ID and create a connection. And then from a web page, I can send emails, but I can't send them any attachments. So, a lot of play-by-mail games that are offered via email today send the results in PDF in Adobe Acrobat format. Those will not work. You'd have to send essentially a 4,000 character or less text email to a prisoner who could then respond to it. So even the play-by-mail games that offer service to prisoners, it's done by postal mail because of the issue around access from the prison to the internet or to attachments. Based on the crime, you actually may not be allowed to access email at all. This is true with both cybercrime prisoners as well as sex crimes prisoners. A lot of them, the judge in the case or the prosecutor in the case will actually limit their access to any sort of email access during their time in prison.
Interesting. It does seem like an untapped market for those companies that are willing to continue to offer their games by mail to market to those who are incarcerated. Because I imagine
Agreed.
Those who are incarcerated do have a small budget from which they can pay for their turns, or do they usually get their turns free? How does that work?
It would be paid because the cost of processing and the postage of sending. In those cases, some inmates have access to work opportunities within a prison, depending upon the prison. And in some cases, they're given a stipend from family. They're given money from family members to play.
That would be, like I said, a great opportunity for companies to start putting some investment into those prison systems to get players. Are there any other comments that you have on the current state of affairs within play-by-mail gaming, within turn-based gaming? You have a much better pulse on it than I do.
Yeah, I would say that the community that exists around the genre. So when you think about the play-by-mail gaming community, it's a mix of nostalgia and kind of hardcore players. So, a lot of us are on the playbymail.net Facebook group, and Charles Mostella does a really great job at posting a lot of nostalgic references to old games, and people post about great memories they have. There's certainly a nostalgia community for play-by-mail. Problem is you're not seeing a lot of players actively participate in multiple games. So back in the 80s and 90s, you would have play-by-mail gamers playing half a dozen or so different games at the same time. So there was a sense that there was a community of players, and people wanted to know what was going on in the community, new games, new opportunities, conferences, magazines in the genre. Now, most players play a single game, and they tend to play that game because they have a nostalgic memory of that game and a time in their life probably that was less complicated when they were a teenager living at home without all the modern day responsibilities that they have today. I'm in 7 different game systems at the same time. That's unheard of. There's almost no one that I know that's playing in more than 1 or 2 games at the same time. Most people are playing just in that one game that they have a personal nostalgic connection to. So it's been a challenge actually to recruit players from other games. In some ways, it's easier to recruit players who have never played at all, because the people who have committed to play-by-mail are committed overly to a single game system, and they're not wanting as much to try new things. The other challenge I think we've had is that game masters have been burnt out over the last 20 or 30 years trying to market their games, and so they've tended to kind of check out and just focus on their one game. In fact, most of the game masters out there have day jobs, and this is something they do on nights and weekends as a fun side project. It may have been their primary career in the 80s or 90s, but now it's something they do on the side. And only in a very, very few number of cases are there companies that are actually generating revenue from running games commercially. In most cases, Game Master is putting in more time than the money they're deriving from the turn fees.
Right. Looking at turn fees and whatnot from an economics point of view, you'd have to have a huge player base in order to make a profit, I would think.
Yeah, and what's interesting to me is as I promote play-by-mail games to other types of gamers, especially board gamers or role-playing gamers, and they go, wait, it costs money to play this game? What? $5 a turn? Are you crazy? Like, I can't afford that. And I have 2 comments to that. First of all, someone's buying a game, whether it's you or the game master. If it's a board game, it's $40 to $80. In the case of role-playing games, it's actually more. And miniatures, it's astronomically more money because you're spending hundreds of dollars on miniatures, paints, materials. There's this false sense of cost that comes as a trade-off. And the other comment is, these are people who have no problem, dropping $5 to $7 a day on a latte or a frappuccino or a candy bar. There's a weird perception that gaming should be free. I think some of this has been ruined by other economic models. For instance, I'm playing an MMO for free right now called Diablo Immortal, which came out a few weeks ago on phones and tablets. And it's free, right? But they're hoping that 1% of the players will spend money on upgrades. And I think that model has caused challenges for play-by-mail games because of the sense that gaming has shifted towards free business models with an upsell component. And in the case of board games, oftentimes you're not the one buying the board game. You're showing up at your friend's house and they already own it.
Yeah. Yeah, and I know when I used to play, for example, when I played Midgard back in the early 2000s, I was spending about $100 a month. I had 9 clans, 9 cities that I ran, and I loved every second of it. And I remember back then I wasn't working at a job that paid well, so I went and donated plasma every month so I could afford to play.
Wow.
I've always loved the turn-based gaming because I tend to be a very sort of cerebral person on the Myers-Briggs personality. I'm an INTJ. I'm in my head a lot.
And I'm INTP, and I think there is a connection. I think there are, looking at Myers-Briggs specifically, I think there are certain types, personality types that this is a perfect genre of games. Like the ideal gaming genre for me is turn-based gaming. Absolutely. for other people who may be extroverted, an E on the Myers-Briggs, this may be an isolating type of experience for them, and they would prefer to go play a board game with friends over a beer.
Yeah, exactly. And I would rather be in my head and sort of plotting and thinking about what I'm doing and, putting it all together. It's been a wonderful gaming experience over the years, and I am very grateful that I've reconnected with that, and I'm able to produce this podcast and try to spread the word that turn-based gaming exists, and it's a lot of fun. And I'd like for there to be a new renaissance within the genre, which brings me to my third point. Let's talk a little bit about the future of turn-based gaming, the future of play-by-mail gaming. What do you see as possibilities?
Well, I've been back to the hobby for 4.5 years, played actively from childhood into early college, and then for all sorts of reasons in the mid-90s, I stopped playing. I did a cross-country move. I got married. I had kids. I changed jobs. Lots of reasons why play-by-mail fell away from focus for me during that period. The increase in the internet and internet-based gaming and multiplayer video games. Console games came out during that time. I had an Xbox and was playing a lot of Halo with friends online. But back in March of 2018, I came back to the hobby. And so it's been 4.5 years for me back playing. I've played probably a dozen or a dozen and a half different game systems in that time. And I'm playing seven games now: Hyborian War, Night Guild, Middle-earth, Supernova, Takamo, TribeNet, and a beta of a new space game called Wraith that just came out. And actually, I spent 4.5 years not only playing, but trying to be an advocate in the hobby, writing about it, participating in various groups, building online forums, and 4.5 years of rolling boulders uphill. It feels a little bit, I'm trying to share my enthusiasm, but I've only seen in that 4.5 year period of time a decrease in activity. There's now less games than there were 4.5 years ago, and there are less players. So it's been frustrating to me personally, because as someone, going back to your point about Myers-Briggs, as someone who is introspective, a little bit introverted, and liked to kind of daydream a bit in my head and plan and think about things. For me, it's the perfect genre. I go play a board game and I leave the board game feeling like, but it could have been so much more. Like, we just scratched the surface of this really amazing experience. And I think for anybody out there that feels like, they experience some fun in whether that's role playing or board gaming or online gaming, but they feel like it's just not immersive enough. It's just not as perfectly suited to their personality. This is the kind of game I think that they're looking for. And unfortunately, it's a small community and getting smaller every year. And when you figure out, how do we recruit players? How do we attract players to this hobby? It's a big challenge. I don't know.
Yeah, like we were talking a little bit about before we press record, it seems to be that the player base is popular. The current player base within turn-based gaming is currently populated mostly by Gen Xers like yourself and like myself.
Yep.
And some of the game masters are the younger side of the boomer population. They're in their 60s and 70s. So checking email is hit or miss, and communicating with them, if you send off for a setup, you may get one in a couple of weeks, or you may not. And that's frustrating. And it needs to be, I think the Gen Xers need to be the game masters now, and then the millennials need to be the players. Of course, I jest. I mean, I want everybody who wants to be a part of this genre to be a part. I'm not ageist, so nobody try to crucify me. But I guess for the future of the genre, there needs to be younger people coming in, like when you were 13 and you were playing, and when I was in my teens and in the military and I was playing. I mean, I was playing Midgard when turns were being processed once every 6 months. I mean, we still stuck with it because it was such a great game.
I agree. I have 4 kids aged 17 to 26, and none of them play by-mail games. I have tried multiple times to get them interested in the hobby, and they kind of turn their head sideways and look at me and go, "I don't get it." And these are the same kids who love playing board games. They love doing role-playing games, and they play a lot of video games. But when I explain the hobby and the benefit and why it's great, I have lost that battle numerous times, and I don't quite understand why. Because they like gaming. in general. They're gaming kids. And, the notion of a 2-week turnaround where you get your orders back and then you spend a couple of weeks planning and writing ideas down and submitting your orders, that seems like such an anachronism to them. Whereas to me, because I have these little 10 to 15 minute chunks of time between other responsibilities as a working adult, it's perfect.
Yeah.
Because I can work on these when I have a little bit of free time. I can't get together with friends and play board games as much as I'd like to because it's a 4 to 6 hour commitment, and then COVID messed that up. To me, this is the perfect genre of games, and it feels to me as though the people who would love it just don't even know it exists. I mean, that's one of the problems, is how do you actually get the word out that this type of genre exists? There are so many popular YouTube channels for board game reviews. I mean, with hundreds of thousands of followers, and these are people who are passionately committed to the board gaming hobby. I would guess that 99% of them don't even know that play-by-mail or turn-based gaming exists. And I'm trying to get at least one of these YouTubers to actually do a special episode just on turn-based gaming, because that could fundamentally change the trajectory, I think, of this hobby.
Oh, absolutely. And I was as you're talking, I'm reflecting on the past, present, and the future of turn-based gaming, and I was thinking about my own self. I mentioned my personality type, and looking back at who I am as a person and what's always energized me. And I've always been a sort of do-it-yourself person, a DIY person. When I was a teenager, I was putting out my own fanzine because I was a commercial art vocational student in vocational school. So I was putting out my own zine. Whenever I read comics, I was a big comic collector. I usually gravitated towards the independently published comics and not the, DC or Marvel, but everything else, but other than DC and Marvel. And I tend to watch more YouTube videos than anything else. Although I'm enjoying the sort of nerd renaissance that we live in now, where there's Star Wars and Star Trek and all sorts of things, but I still have that do-it-yourself spirit, and play-by-mail gaming always seemed to kind of fit into that category. Yeah, back in the 80s you had like TSR, which was bought out by Wizards of the Coast, and you had all these big companies that produced these games, but then you had the guy who created a game and ran it through the mail. And I just thought that was awesome and fascinating. And like you, I probably got introduced to the genre through Dragon Magazine or through some other magazine. And I know I had written articles as a teenager for both Paper Mayhem and Flagship Magazine. But I think I was at a convention and there was a booth by a play-by-mail company. And I think that's how I initially got introduced to the genre. And then once I got sort of my foot wet and started playing a game, then those ads that I saw in magazines, I was more interested in trying them out because I'd already played a game, because I met somebody at a convention. I remember Anton Games, which offered the game Family Wars. I remember getting into that, and I loved it. And I just looked them up, and they've been defunct since I think the mid-90s.
Oh, yeah.
And it just makes me sad because that was a good game, and with a little updating, and maybe not even updating, maybe just offer it as it was back then, it was a good game. And there was a lot of good games out there, and some are still around, but a lot are gone.
A lot are gone. The good news is there are still some great ones that are available, and I hope they will continue to be made available. I think we're getting ready for a whole generational shift. A lot of the game masters are in their 60s and going on into their 70s, and I think you're going to see a transition. And my hope is that transition is to hand the game over to another game master and not for those games to get retired, because there are some games that have been running for decades and they're in a rich, immersive world, and it's such a great experience being a part of that. I wouldn't want to see those come to an end. I mean, one of the things that we should talk about a little bit, if we've hinted to it, I think, chatting for this podcast, is, the turns themselves aren't what inherently makes play-by-mail an interesting hobby. I mean, certainly it's great to get results back and to read over your multi-page turns and see what happened and understand the change in your position from turn 1 to turn 2. But the something that's magical is what you do between turns, right? So it's a combination of outreaching to other players, doing diplomacy, making deals and trades, but also just drive time. I mean, both you and I spend a fair amount of time in our cars, back and forth to various places, and I'm plotting and planning my turn while I'm driving. I'm using that cognitive cerebral capability while I'm doing other things to come up with my plans for the next turn. And there's really no other genre of games where you play a game when you're not playing the game.
That's right.
and it's really exceptional. You can offload a lot of that time to personal time and think about things and plan and strategize when you're not actually doing your orders.
Yeah, that's right. And that's one of the things that I really, really like about turn-based gaming is the plotting, the imagination, the working on stuff in between the processing of the turns. That's really where the magic happens.
I agree.
And I know one thing, you mentioned long car rides through work and whatnot. I have recently downloaded some music that I used to listen to when I did my turns way back in the 80s and early 90s. and it's all like instrumental, new agey music that I got from Columbia House. That, remember Columbia House, where you get like 15 cassettes or whatever. And so I'm re-listening to some of this music in my car as I think about these games, and it's really helping me get into the mindset that I used to have, because part of it's learning how to kind of think a little bit differently. Playing a board game like Risk, you think a certain way, but when you play a turn-based play-by-mail gaming that may last years, as long as you like an open-ended game, your thinking is different when it comes to the game. You have to be a long-term strategist. You have to, and it's really about building relationships with multiple people over a long period of time.
Agreed.
And there was a situation, I won't mention any names, but there was some grudges from 20 some years ago, and those grudges are still there. It's like they never ended. And I look back and I'm like, I am not the same person I was 20 years ago. but in the gaming community, maybe I'm perceived as that same 20-something arrogant, obnoxious kid that I was. But it's just, my hope is that the future will be good for turn-based gaming, and everything goes in kind of cycles. And if the 80s, if the 10 years from late 80s to the late 90s was sort of the golden age, and then we had a slump period, my hope is that we're on the rise and that good things are going to happen.
That would be great, but I think at this point, 4.5 years back to the hobby, I've become a little bit cynical. I try not to think of myself as a cynical person. I like to be an optimist and not a pessimist. But part of it is I've been ground down for 4.5 years trying to advocate and evangelize the hobby. Where I'm at personally, and just my own opinion, is we need a breakthrough moment. I thought it was going to be COVID, but none of the GMs in the hobby took advantage of that for marketing. I think the breakthrough moment we need in this hobby is probably to harness some of that enthusiasm for board gaming, which probably means getting one of the YouTube personalities who covers board gaming, like a Shut Up and Sit Down or Dice Tower or one of these guys, to actually do an episode on turn-based gaming and just do a deep dive. Like, what is the hobby? How is it different? What are the pros and cons? Why would some board gamers like this hobby versus others? And to me, that's the best opportunity, I think, is to take some of that enthusiasm for, we're in the golden age of board gaming. Since about 2012, it's been about 10 years, there's been a massive increase in board gaming. And that, I think, is where we need to look for growth. And I just don't know how we can do it without getting one of the advocates of the board gaming community to become at least a communicator about the turn-based gaming community.
Well, one thing that we can do is any one of us could start a TikTok and talk about turn-based gaming.
Yeah.
I have a YouTube account, and I will probably make this podcast available on YouTube. That doesn't mean anybody's gonna listen to it on YouTube, but we'll most likely have a YouTube channel as well. It just needs to go viral a little. The only problem is if it goes viral a lot, most of these companies wouldn't be able to handle 1,000 setup requests. I mean, it would certainly be nice to see if a couple of companies could, but I know that, many of them would probably not be able to handle a massive influx of players, but it would certainly be a good problem to have. And,
yeah, absolutely.
And if that did become an issue, I mean, if there was a huge influx of either our generation, the Gen X, or even the younger millennials, an influx of players, and some of the games just weren't able to handle the massive numbers, well, then hopefully new game masters would start up and new games would come out, and that's where I think the future would be with new innovation in the hobby.
Yeah, I've been told that the TV show Stranger Things did cause a growth in the role-playing gaming, people coming back to Dungeons & Dragons. I haven't seen any data that confirms that, but anecdotally I've heard that Stranger Things did boost some role-playing gaming because that plays a role in that TV show. So maybe we just need, kind of a media or cultural event like that. There is a novel about play-by-mail games called Wolf in White Van that is probably not a mainstream story that could necessarily be turned into a television series or a film. But, if you have maybe the inclusion of turn-based gaming into one of these media events, maybe that would be a key as well.
Yeah, or maybe if somebody could do like a documentary, that would be neat too. But regardless of what happens, I'm glad I've rediscovered turn-based gaming, and I'm certainly glad that you have as well. Throughout the years, I had wondered what happened to you, and now we were able to reconnect because it's it's a small world, and the community is a small community. And it was funny because I think we connected not knowing that we had that connection, and then we put the dots together, and we're like, oh yeah, we know each other, and that was kind of neat. And I remember back like some of the games I played, and let's end on a sort of a nostalgic note, since you mentioned nostalgia. And I was going to talk about some of the games that I played way back when. I remember playing It's a Crime, the New York gang warfare game, and I still remember some of the position names of some of the top 10 players. I know there was one, Degenerate Pond Scum is a name that I'll never forget, and they were a gang that I think took me out of the game. And then I told you I played Family Wars and loved that game, and I played a game called Divine Wind briefly, and it was a great game. And my character's name, the game was about Japanese medieval warfare, and it was like a board game, but they had special actions. And my main character was Toshiro Takakoshi, and I negotiated the marriage between my daimyo and another player's daughter, and his character's name was Lord Okami. I mean, it was just through a series of special actions through the game, we united our two positions through marriage in the game, and it was just neat. And all the different games that I played, I have these memories of, and I kind of wanted to end on that, but I wanted you to maybe share some of your memories from the games that you've played in the past.
I have so many, and in fact, I'm going to be writing an article about this in an upcoming issue of Suspense and Decision magazine called 10 True Childhood Stories from Play-by-Mail Gaming. But I'll just share one of those 10 stories. I've got a bunch. Back in 1985, when I was 12 years old, I was playing a game called Earthwood. Earthwood was by a PBM company called Game Systems Incorporated. Most people knew of them as GSI. They were based in Miami, Florida. They ultimately went on to create the game Middle Earth PBM, which is still being run today by a company in Cardiff, Wales, UK, which bought the rights to it and is running it now if you go to middleearthgames.com. But I was playing in a game of Earthwood back in 1985 when I was 12, a position called the Rumonians, which was kind of like a Greek civilization. And, back then you would send 3x5 cards in the orders. You would put a 3x5 card, to this position from this position in the envelope, and then the game master would pass along those note cards. I wish I kept those note cards from when I was a kid because they were amazing. Some of them had illustrations on them and just incredible. So I received a note card from the Mammoth Men, which was a position near me. He included his phone number, which is pretty common. And so I was a kid, 12-year-old kid, talking to an adult, which is a little bit interesting, negotiating with an adult for this position. And I had to pay long distance, very expensive. And we had plans to work together and I shared all the details about where my armies were going to be, and we're going to arrive at this place at this turn. And then several turns later, his entire military force shows up at my capital and kills me. So, here I was, this trusting little kid talking to an adult, thinking we were going to be best friends, and only learned that I was backstabbed. So, those kinds of experiences, I think, really help to inform kind of the naivete of being a kid player and realizing that there was a brutal player base that wanted to win that you had to be careful about negotiating with.
Yeah, I think we all have those stories of betrayal and whatnot. And I tend not to be that kind of player. If I tell you something, I'm gonna follow through with that.
I'm the same way, and I tend to my word, I hope, will mean something. Although when you're talking with a stranger, you don't know what their intents and motivations are, and they don't know whether you're a trustworthy person. So, trust is hard. You have to rebuild from scratch every time because you're dealing with new people. But, not every game is like that. I mean, there are some that are military focused. I know that your podcast title is, more around the military-focused terms, but some play-by-mail games are much more role-playing or character-focused than they are about moving militaries on the battlefield and engaging in warfare. I would say most of the play-by-mail games that I'm playing now, warfare is only one of many components. And in fact, in a couple of the games that I've been playing the longest, I've never actually been at battle at all.
Yeah, I'm not a combat-based player. I'm more of a civilization builder. But when it came to coming up with the name for the podcast, that's always a challenge, and it's very challenging. So I picked Combat Conditional because it's a term that was part of Midgard and now Night Guild, a game that I'm very, very fond of. And when I was trying to come up with a name, I kept kind of coming back to play by mail, but I know that's a term that's become kind of anachronistic with some. So I didn't want to use like the play by mail podcast because that would alienate certain people. And then we had the new term of turn-based gaming. So I decided, this phrase combat conditional just kept coming back. And I thought, well, maybe that's a sign. I'll use that. And if it doesn't work, later I can rebrand and come up with a new name. But for now, combat conditional it is until it doesn't serve our purpose, and then we'll just go ahead and change it. But naming's always a challenge. But we are almost at an hour mark. I thank you, Raven, for your time. It's always good talking to you, and I would, of course, love to have you on as a regular guest host on this podcast as we promote turn-based gaming.
That'd be great. I'm looking forward to future episodes of your podcast.
Thank you for listening. My name is David Oliver Kling, and I have been your host. I have been playing turn-based gaming since I was a teenager back in 1986. I love this genre of gaming, and I hope you do too. Please check out our sponsor, Suspense and Decision Magazine. And may your turns always arrive on time in good gaming.